I really appreciate such a generous and wonderful introduction, Noreen. And once again, many thanks for the invitation. And also congratulations on establishing this peer network, which is such an important initiative. And I'm looking forward to participating in many other events that you will be organizing throughout the years. This is very exciting and a much needed mobilization of ideas and people and networks across the different regions. So it's really wonderful. I will share my screen for a presentation. And 1 second. All right. I think that's it. Here we go. And somebody will help admit more people in the room, right? Because I won't probably be able to keep track of it.
Yes, will do.
Thank you. Thank you so much again. So I will talk today about education beyond the Western horizon, rethinking education values and policy transfer. And I will try to build here both on some of my previous work with which you probably are familiar, but also maybe show how I have been moving and linking some of this work with the decolonial literature in particular. So the first part of the presentation probably will be similar, familiar to what you may have read or heard before, but I think it will maybe give a sense for how my own thinking is moving. So it will be in a way a little bit of a tracing of trajectory of my own thinking during the last 15 years or so. And I will start with this discussion of education policy, borrowing and transfer, which has been very central to my own research and also to many of you in the audience as well. But I think what we have seen in the past few decades, and especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, is that this dominant understanding of education policy has shifted pretty dramatically. In the past, education policy was seen as a reflection of particular historical, political, social, economic, and cultural configurations of a given country. But today, policy is increasingly understood as heavily influenced by extra-national forces, so that policies from elsewhere are seen as possible reform options, right? And so here I refer to the influences from international agencies or kind of other globalization forces, whether it's OECD and its PISA program, or whether it's some of the actually locally initiated links to the kind of global networks and global so-called best practices. And yet I wanted to say that this perspective is not new. All modern education systems arose relationally, be it through the purposeful learning from systems elsewhere or by forceful implant by globalizing or colonizing powers. But what is different is at the levels of recognition of global entanglement. So arguably, most non-Western countries cannot even imagine education or education policy without reference to the Western world at this point. So the legacy of Western colonization remains very, very powerful. Western-led development ensures constant comparison or the analytical frameworks that are used to understand education. They remain imbued with this Western experience and perspective. And in these contexts, and I would argue in the majority of the world, including in Central Asia and the rest of the former Soviet Union, education policy inevitably and automatically invokes comparison and contextualization in the wider world. However, in contrast, in most of the Western countries, we still see a lack of recognition of education policy as relational and globally entangled. Having never experienced colonization, at least on the receiving end, and viewing the analytical frameworks as rather universal than particular, these countries, the Western countries or the Northern countries, which constitute the minority of the world, only now coming to recognize the comparative and global dimensions of education. So there is this really interesting, I think, mismatch about how we think about the global entanglement and comparison. And like I said, so in the, whether it's Central Asian region or many of the non-Western regions, actually these ideas, the education borrowing and transfer is really looked at as more relational and globally entangled, but whether it's not really the case in the West. And so there are obviously limitations to kind of this framing of education policy and borrowing. And one of the major limitations is that we have to face this idea of TINA, that perception that there is simply no other alternatives except for whatever we are being compared against or compare ourselves against, right? And usually it's this dichotomy between the East and the West, at least in the post-socialist region that we are discussing. And this is a real problem, whether this neoliberal education policies are forcefully imposed by international experts or agencies, or whether they are willingly adopted by local stakeholders, the assumption is that there is simply no other alternatives. And so this question really has, very personally bothered me for a very long time. And for a very long, for probably more than a decade in my own career, I was, trying to critique the education policy borrowing and transfer as a concept and as a process to show resistance to these globalization movements, to show modifications that are done in the process of the adapting these global reforms locally, and also showing the alternatives. And yet it's very difficult to show these alternative approaches when you constantly compare against globalization, right? Or against the Western reform efforts, because as some of the authors like Staheli, for example, mentioned before, when you compare against globalization, it becomes simply impossible to see anything outside of it, right? It becomes a very kind of one-sided comparison. And I'll just very briefly try to go through, some of these, critiques that I myself tried to work with in the past, right? And, first of all, it was trying to unpack this global education reform package and to see what's there and why it is imposed and how this process is happening. And I have, kind of starting to unpack of it, these global reform packages do have very particular features, right? And you can see in particular that one maybe part of these, one of the themes, well, one of the ingredients is in these reform packages are these international development prescriptions that are related to international development agencies, especially organizations like the World Bank, that include this pressure to reduce public expenditure on education, increase private spending on education, decentralize education finance and governance, rationalize school staff and reorganize schools to increase efficiency, reduce wastages and leakages. So it's like one very particular theme. Another one are these features in this global education reform package that are related to the Cold War legacies, like extending education from 11 to 12 years, redefining curriculum standards in terms of outcomes-based education, introducing standardized assessment systems, and in particular standardized centralized university entrance examinations, which we have seen quite a lot in the region, market-driven textbook provision, increased education choice, student-centered learning versus teacher-centered learning, or other educational approaches. So kind of very standardized package of reforms that is being transferred, right, to the region. And then, of course, there are some also features that are related to the country or the region-specific needs, such as girls' education or peace education or education in emergencies or rural education and inclusive education. And more recently, education for sustainable development and happiness and well-being. And of course, there is apparent similarity of all of these global education reforms, which has really bothered me also for the last few years, especially thinking how striking it is that the reforms, despite the vast cultural and contextual difference, we see very strikingly similar reforms across the world, right? And so here comes some of my past critique of the world culture theory, for example, that explains globalization as this very consensus-driven approach and agreement about what constitutes best practice. But that always bothered me, right? Especially reading some of the World Bank reports or some of the OECD country assessments where, whether you're reading about Latvia or Kazakhstan, the problems, or Zimbabwe, for example, you see the problems identified as exactly the same and the solutions are prescribed as exactly the same, right? And usually it follows exactly the same formula. So a particular country is in crisis and it is in need of a comprehensive education reform. And then a prescription follows, right? And this is this reform package that comes ready with packed best education practices. And so the focus is on fixing education with norms that are anchored in this unexamined faith in a Western culture. And I found this really problematic. So in kind of earlier in my work, I really tried to understand how this colonial logic is being produced even without colonization, and why we are stuck in this particular framework, and how we can get out of it. And so part of my examination, of course, was the whole kind of how this whole idea of crisis is constructed. And so these are just some of the examples from earlier works that I have done. And just even looking at the titles of some of the international development agency reports is just very, very telling how the crisis is identified, whether the crisis actually exists or doesn't exist, right? And so these are just some examples. So for example, so what did collapse in 1991? Reflections from the Revolution Betrayed, or Incubators of Conflict, Central Asia's poverty and social unrest, failed transition, bleak future, instability in Central Asia and the Caucasus. So these titles really are revealing, right, about how the particular regions or countries are constructed by the West. And so most of these are written, of course, by the Western experts, right? So Central Asia, a gathering storm, or radical Islam inevitable in Central Asia, cracks in the marble, Turkmenistan's failing dictatorship. Just a few more examples for you. Kyrgyzstan, a faltering state, Kazakhstan waiting for change, Tajikistan on the road to failure. And so also these examples are from kind of a decade ago almost now. Even today, we can find very similar reports with very similar titles that are written about the countries. So these are some of the publications that are specifically focused on education. So for example, A Generation at Risk, or Losing the New Generation, The Hidden Crisis, right? So these are kind of framing in very particular ways the way we view education. And it's really interesting because it affects how we in the region think about education as well. And so what we see in these reports usually is that the West is constructed as tolerant, efficient, active, developed, organized, and democratic, and the East is developed as, is described as constructed as intolerant, corrupt, passive, underdeveloped, chaotic, undemocratic. And just if we look at the teachers, for example, in particular, Laura Perry did also really interesting analysis. So she summarized very nicely. So she described how the post-socialist teachers are often described in these reports as focusing too much on memorization and facts, not enough on application, problem solving, reasoning, analysis, and critical thinking. Teachers are too controlling and authoritative. Teachers are too passive, inflexible, or unable to adapt or take initiative. So it's one problem after another, after another, after another, without any consideration to the context within which the teachers are working, or for that matter, to the cultures within which teachers are operating, and also the possibility that, for example, non-student-centered learning may be meaningful in some ways as well, right? And maybe reflect responding to particular cultural traditions. So, and of course, I also was really interested to look at kind of the power of the experts in particular. And this was actually, maybe I'll tell a kind of more personal story, because whether I lived in Kazakhstan or when I worked in Latvia, I had so many encounters myself with the Western experts who come to the region to make an education assessment, right? And so one of the stories, actually the reason why I decided to go to do a PhD in education, in comparative education, was when I worked in Latvia for the Open Society Foundations, for the Soros Foundations. We had a team from OECD who came to Latvia, and that was at the end of the 1990s, to do a country assessment on the status of education. They came for a week. They spoke with a lot of people. Many of them have never been to the region before, although they actually did include on the team one of the colleagues who was from Lithuania. But they came for a week. They interviewed a bunch of people, including me, and I thought we had a really wonderful interview, really interesting interview. They interviewed my colleagues that I did not have a PhD at the time. They had interviewed my colleagues who had PhDs from Latvia and from Europe and from the West at that point. They spoke with ministry officials, they spoke with teachers, and then about a year later, half a year later, they produced a report. And the report said, and this is this 2001 report that is mentioned, quoted here at the end of the slide. It concluded that the OECD team is concerned that the Ministry of Education is seriously challenged in its capacity to accomplish its current legal mandate, that in order for the Latvian Ministry of Education to make transition to the more strategic leadership role that is required to move education forward, they need to rely on the Western experts. And so this was a major shock to me, right? I was thinking, how is it possible that they say that there is no expertise, policy expertise in Latvia, right? When I am working with all these amazing people. And for a brief second, I thought, well, maybe there is some things that I don't know, right? And, you know, maybe there are some skills and expertise that I personally don't have yet, and I need to have, you know, in order to be able to help Latvia with the transition. So that was one of the impetus for me to go and do my PhD program at Teachers College at Columbia University. And of course, as soon as I came and began my studies, I knew that it was not a matter of expertise that was a problem, not a matter of local expertise that was a problem, but it was really a problem of the global power dynamics and, you know, the way the Western experts positions themselves and their knowledge against the local experts and the local knowledges. Anyways, but then when I later on started looking, you know, at these, in particular OECD reports that they were writing one after another at that particular point of time, I, you know, realized that they had very similar almost identical conclusions about other countries as well. So for example, in Kosovo, there is a lack of professional capacity and strategic vision about the current reform. Or in Albania, there is a lack of knowledge and skills to aid reform in the governance of education. And of course, in Central Asia, very similar to, and maybe even more pronounced, right? So in Tajikistan, management and planning capacity in the ministry remains very limited for supporting tasks such as policy development, long-term planning, monitoring and evaluation system, assessment of performance of the education system, and reforms undertaken, everything basically, right? In Kazakhstan, there is a lack among the vocational education and training staff of pedagogic competences and of awareness of the potential role of VET in strengthening and modernizing the Kazakh economy, or that the change is essential for better education, but an underfunded school network will have a limited capacity to absorb the new ideas and deliver according to new quality standards. But so what is interesting here is that these assessments and conclusions then immediately position the international agencies or the Western experts as the ones that have the answers, right? And, very prescribed answers to the reforms. And so this big questions that I, had at that time and, still have now is how did the single vision become so globally dominant? And more importantly, what is beyond this Western horizon? So this is this question. The last question is the one that has been really driving my research agenda in the last few years, right? And I think it partially was my own frustration with the fact that just critiquing these global education policy borrowing processes was not enough, because when I was doing that, the big limitation was that if you take globalization or Western reforms as a reference point, then it's really impossible to see the alternatives. You can see resistance to the globalization, or you can see different interpretations to this, global reform package, but it's very difficult to see what lies outside of it, right? And it was really, I think, revealing and kind of frustrating to me at one point to realize that there is so much more going on, whether it's in Latvia or in Kazakhstan or, in other contexts beyond these global reforms that we simply do not see, because we are so fixated on trying to understand how the countries are dealing with these globalization processes. So, I kind of started moving away from that a little bit to see about what are the alternatives to globalization, right? Or what are the alternatives to these global reform packages that already exist? And how can we bring them into focus? Because there is a lot out there, right, beyond this global reform education package. And so this question, what is beyond the Western horizon, is the one that I have been trying to grapple with kind of more recently. And so I'll talk about this. And here I was, really drawing on the work of Walter Mignolo and Madina Tlostanova and others who write from the decolonial perspective. And so this is from Mignolo's book, The Darker Side of Western Modernity, where he talks about how important it is to multiply options rather than eliminate them. And how this is really the road to the global futures that are not single, right, but multiple. So that kind of idea of multiplication of options, seeing that there are other alternatives, right, multiple ones, is, I think, what kind of has been driving some of my work more lately. And so this is, very briefly, the framework that Mignolo proposes, and he talks about how, we are moving, that there are multiple trajectories that are shaping the global futures, and they exist in parallel. And some of them, like the ReWesternization here in the middle, the second one, is very dominant right now. or reorientation to the left is kind of resurging as another, very dominant paradigm. But there are other paradigms as well, other trajectories of development that are happening as well, like DeWesternization, the decolonial options, the spiritual options, which I will talk about, separately as well. But so he basically talks about how our futures will depend on how these different trajectories unfold. And in a way, I would argue also how we as researchers and policymakers are able to bring into focus some of these different trajectories. And more importantly, I think it's a challenge to myself, but also a challenge that I would like to pose to all of us, to maybe discuss later on, how do we see ourselves fitting within these different trajectories, right? And which of these trajectories do we, help move forward and advance? And so really quickly, we can talk about these, different trajectories. So well, actually here is a very short quote from Mignolo, who basically says how in the forthcoming decades, the world order will be decided in the struggles, negotiations, competitions, and collaborations between these 5 different coexisting trajectory, and without a winner. So kind of his ideal is that all 5 should be possible on a non-hierarchical basis, right? That there should be a space for all of these different trajectories to develop and and unfold in the contemporary world. And I think policy transfer research is really critical here as well, and I think it can help us make visible these different alternatives, right, and think about them differently. And as I said, so that really means that we as researchers are forced to think through and clarify our own values, and where do we ourselves stand, and which of these ideas do we, help let unfold. And so very quickly, and I'll go into more detail in a few minutes, but so Westernization entails the further expansion of the Western liberal model. And it is most recognizable in the guise of neoliberal policy. The pillars of the project are saving capitalism, reloading, revamping through science and technology. And so that's a very familiar, I think, trajectory to all of us, the dominant one. Then another one that is very strong is reorientation to the left, which challenges the re-Westernization, but still have very similar similarities with Westernization, especially its belief in universality, but I'll talk about it a little bit later. Then we also have another trajectory that is called DeWesternization. And at the beginning, it looks like it's a clean break from Western frameworks and from the first 2 options, but still it also has shares the same drive to identify some universal dominant economic trajectory. And again, it's a capitalism. It's shifting the power towards away from the West and perhaps into Asia, but the idea is that you still believe in this universal solution that capitalism proposes. And China is a really good example here, right? China increasingly rejects Washington's dictates as it grows more confident with its global leadership role, yet the politically driven, the process largely means accelerating the move toward China taking control of the locus of the global economy. That is, China seeks not to change the structure and hierarchy of the global order created by Western powers epistemologies, but simply assert control of it. So then we have the decolonial option, which signifies the attempt to divest from the forms of Western knowledge imposed during the course of colonialism. And the key term here is delinking, signifying an unhitching from the Western economic forms and political authority, and particularly epistemic and subjective starting points. And then the last one is a spiritual option, which we in our work try to also define as an ontological option, which is an attempt to decolonize at even a deeper level, centered on the triad of knowledge, subjectivity, and religion. And what the spiritual option offers is a contribution for opening up horizon of life that have been kept hostage by modernity, capitalism, and the belief in the superiority of the Western intellectual tradition. So let me move forward here. And so there is a difference here, maybe, that we have to also make really quickly between post-colonialism and decolonialism, right? And because there are all kinds of debates whether, for example, the post-socialist space is a post-colonial space or not, right? Because it can be argued that the Soviet republics, for example, were colonized by Russia, and this is certainly the case, I would say, with the Baltic republics, but may not necessarily be the case with all of the other republics that may have joined the Soviet Union willingly. But what Mignolo does, so that basically post-colonialism deals very specifically with formerly colonized countries. Decolonialism talks about the colonization of knowledge and subjectivity, right? So even if a country has not been formally colonized, physically colonized, it may experience the colonial imperial effects of stemming from the global power dynamics, right? And in fact, Mignolo says that the modernity itself has a dark side, and that dark side is coloniality. So it's the two sides of the same coin, right? And so this is what I will try to talk about here. So I'll talk about the coloniality of knowledge production that exists whether a country may have been colonized or not. And here we can distinguish between, well, I think we can outline how this coloniality of power moves in two simultaneous directions. One is the analytic and the other one is the programmatic. So the concept of coloniality opened up spaces for the reconstruction and the restitution of silent histories, repressed subjectivities, subalternized knowledges and languages. Postmodern critique of grand narrative does not go far enough, since it is internal to European history and the history of the idea. So it doesn't recognize how Western languages and categories of thought, and therefore political philosophy and political economy, were marching and expanding without recognizing other languages and knowledges as equal players in the game. And then the second direction is the programmatic. So, and here the critique doesn't link to post-coloniality, dependent on post-structural or postmodern theory, but decoloniality, as I mentioned before. So it manifests or means or entails delinking, a delinking that leads to decolonial epistemic shift and foregrounds other epistemologies, other principles of knowledge and understanding, and consequently other economy, other politics, other ethics, for not a universal knowledge, but a pluriversal knowledge, rather than the totality of one epistemology, right? So that would be the difference. And so Medina Tlastanova writes really powerfully about this decolonial move, and she works very closely with artists in Central Asia too, in trying to kind of really mobilize this decolonial thought, especially in the art space, but also in the academic space. So she talks about this coloniality of knowledge as an epistemic regime of modernity that subsumed all levels of cognition and interpretation of the world to the norms creating and imposed by Western modernity, and offered to humankind as universal, localized and disembodied. Decolonizing knowledge means destabilizing the subject-object relationship from the position of those who have been denied subjectivity and rationality, and undermining the very grounds of the epistemic matrix of modernity, right? And so to me, this matrix of modernity, I think we can really clearly see this in these international development reports that I just briefly mentioned, right? The kind of the position of the Western experts in the region. So this all constitutes that matrix of modernity. And the idea is, how do we undermine this, and how do we undermine this project, and how do we enable ourselves to see the alternatives beyond it? And yeah, so basically, how do we unhitch ourselves from the wider global plot, right? So this is what the Mignola would invite us to do, because there are other narratives and other stories and other visions, right? And other futures that are possible. But which futures are we ourselves as researchers are working towards? And so I will go, let me quickly look at the time. Let me go quickly through some of these, very quickly through some of these 5 trajectories, just to give some examples and maybe just discuss it a little bit more. But also, as you listen to it, maybe think about your own work. Where do you think that fits? So the works that you engage with, which of these trajectories does it fall into? So the first one, as I mentioned, is the re-Westernization. So that is securing, really basically fighting for the global future of capitalism, market economy, democracy, as well as the philosophical tenets of liberalism that underpin it. It's an attempt, very purposeful attempt, to rebuild or prop up a flagging global confidence in the leadership of the US and the Western Europe. And so these reports that we reviewed before from OECD and the World Bank are really great examples. And this rhetoric of knowledge for development, best practice, economic growth, it all falls into this trajectory, right? Like, these are all very purposeful efforts to promote this new liberal logic in the education systems worldwide. Then the second one that I mentioned is reorientation to the left. And this is various leftist orientation seeking visions for alternative non-capitalist futures. And it may include research directly critiquing the ReWesternization project, or mapping alternative education trajectories of the global left. And here we see, such research as South-South education transfer, for example, or the critiques of patriarchy, racism, and sexism. If we talk about mapping alternative education trajectories, we see, for example, the landlords workers movement in Brazil, or the Escuela Nueva in Colombia, or the BROC non-formal primary education programs in Bangladesh, and many more research. But as I mentioned before, and what Medina Tlostanova and Walter Mignola really powerfully also remind us is that these leftist orientations to seek universal solutions. So here the idea is that we replace capitalist knowledge production with alternative non-capitalist futures, right? So it's a universal project, again, that does not allow necessarily for the plurality of knowledges, but that insists on one solution that is reorientation to the left of the whole world, right? Then we have the de-Westernization that I mentioned before, which shares the same underlying commitment to capitalism in modernity, but it's not a movement of anti, but self-affirmation. And so here, East and Southeast Asia are really interesting examples, especially these Look East campaigns, for example, that take Japan as an exemplar and import policies and experts and training schemes into the Malaysia, as Shibata wrote in her research, but many others do research on that too, right? My student Gong wrote a really interesting paper for the volumes that we edited with Sarfaros Niyozov on the South Korean development assistance in Central Asia, where on the surface, it looks like it could be South-South transfer, right? And some of the South Korea working in Uzbekistan, that may have different dynamics of international development. But then when you look deeper into this, it really looks that the South Korea becomes the middleman in the global education marketplace, right? Because it delivers to Kazakhstan exactly the same neoliberal packages, but it asserts itself as an expert, right? So it's a middleman between the Western neoliberal reforms. But also here, I think an interesting, like as I mentioned before, kind of here the idea is that you operate with the same principles of neoliberal capitalism, but you shift the power from the West to the East in this particular case. But the principles are the same. And then we have a decolonial option, which is a very distinct break with modernity associated with many forms of capitalism, socialism, or other abstract universalisms. So this is an option that does not insist on universalism, but asks for a pluriversality. So Mignolo tries to kind of change the language here, right? And so he says that what we need is changing the terms and not just the content of the conversation, right? So for him, the other three options were just changing the content of the conversation. So you replace one universal content with another, but here you change the whole terms of the conversation by opening it to multiple knowledges, right? So it's a move from universality to pluriversality. And here some of the examples would be Chen's Asia as method, where Asia is seen as an alternative horizon perspective and a method for posing different sets of questions about the world history. He in particular talks about the knowledge interreferencing within the Asian region. So basically what happens if you remove the West as a single yardstick for comparison, right? And what if you compare against a different standard, right? So then the way you see knowledge and knowledge dynamics changes dramatically. So he attempts to recenter Asia as a source of multiplicity of new knowledge flows. And then we have this spiritual and ontological option that advocates decolonizing religion to liberate spirituality, aiming at finding new ways of life beyond capitalism and its magic of modernity. So here we see the opening of new ontological possibilities that refuse the secular materialist worldview as a starting and end point of research. And in fact, this decolonial and spiritual ontological options are very closely interrelated. And I would argue that spiritual ontological option is probably the one that is least developed in Mignolo's work. But what we see here is an attempt to bring into dialogue different onto-epistemic perspectives. And so some of the work here is related to the post-secular turn or the ontological turn. You can find some examples there, or the work that seeks to center spirituality in the academy. And so Riyad Shahnajan actually is doing some really interesting work on it, and he's talking at the same time at the University of Hong Kong right now too. So we have the competing talks, but he's doing really interesting work in that area as well. So as I mentioned before, then the goal is how can we multiply the options rather than eliminate them? And so Mignolo would argue that this multiplication requires delinking from this dichotomous logic where we see the world in, the West and the rest, right? And how can we delink from this logic of universality and kind of single vision and no alternative to a space where we can begin to bring into focus the different knowledge traditions, bring them into focus and into the conversation. And I think here, we as researchers actually play a really important role. And so Mignolo writes how this delinking requires an economic, political, philosophical, ethical reframing of the terms of the conversations that makes the Bible, Adam Smith, and Karl Marx necessary, because Western categories of thoughts have been globalized through the logic of coloniality and the rhetoric of modernity, but highly insufficient, right? So it's not necessarily erasing all of the past, but it's making it insufficient in itself. It's arguing that there is much more that exists and that needs to be part of the conversation for us to move into the, more livable futures. And of course, I would argue that this all may kind of poses challenges to the next generation of research. And that's why I think it's very exciting. And so these challenges are, first of all, the awareness of our own values and the ways that our own research embodies such normative commitments. So, and that's the challenge that I posed before. So where do we ourselves fall on these different trajectories? Another challenge is the move from dichotomy to relationality. So that's something that I, again, mentioned before. How do we produce work not only about the relationships, but from the relationships? I think that's an important point as well. How do we see education policy transfer in more relational ways, and not, again, as kind of single, independent, standalone knowledge flows? And importantly, which trajectory are we working from and towards ourselves, right? So I think it's a challenge that I think is important for us to, a question and a challenge that it's important for us to pose to ourselves as well. And yeah, and that's, I will stop here, and I would love to hear the comments, the questions, some of the thoughts that this may have provoked. But this was an attempt to maybe share with you a little bit more how my own thinking, especially on education policy, borrowing and transfer, has evolved, and where I am right now, and how I'm trying to work with some of these, the decolonial and the ontological spiritual options in some of my more recent research that I didn't have a chance to talk about, but I can mention maybe briefly in the question and answer session. But thank you, and I'm looking forward to a discussion.